TK, what makes a good sprint car driver?
You know, it's hard to say nowadays. You know, growing up when I did it, it was for the passion. You know, the passion, the drive, the adrenaline rush. Nowadays, it's tend to kind of gone to the money aspect of it, where you know the parents want their kid to be the next Jeff Gordon, Tony Stewart, Kyle Larson, you know, anything to that nature, and you know they'll throw whatever it takes. You know, in any sport nowadays, you know they'll throw as much money as it is to have their kid, you know, be able to be the next greatest thing. You know, I grew up in between that era. You know, where you know you still had to go out and prove who you could be in a race car and your toughness, likeness, and you had to be able to please the fans in the process. You know, I grew up when you know Jack Hoddenchild was in his prime. You know, just watching him race, and Jack Hewitt, Steve Kinzer, Bobby Davis Jr. You know, those guys were, you know, the guys that I looked up to as a kid. You know, because they were able to do something for a living that they enjoyed. You know, making money, racing, traveling the world. You know, and nowadays it's you know, a lot of families. You know, it's a family-oriented sport more now than it probably ever has been. But a lot of families, you know, you lose a lot of stuff in the process nowadays.
So did you have a single favorite as a kid?
You know, it's hard to say. I mean, growing up watching my dad race, you know, he was always, you know, an icon in California. You know, he was the guy that the Outlaws had to worry about growing up. You know, when the Outlaws came to the West Coast, he was that guy that, you know, could run up from with those guys. You know, probably one of my favorite drivers growing up would have probably been Jack Hewitt. You know, the guy could get in anything. You know, he's, you know, one of the only guys that has won an actual 4-crown, you know, event. You know, Kyle Larson did the 3-crown, or if you know you call it that or whatever. But Jack Hewitt could get in anything and race. You know, I mean, he was a down to earth guy. You know, we hung out with him a lot when he came out to the West Coast. But he had the drive. He had the tenacity to go out there, you know, and drive whatever he needed to make money to put food on his table, you know. And he would jump in, you know, a stock car, get in a Silver Crown car the next day, and, you know, go to Indianapolis 500, you know, the year that he went there. And, you know, just being able to do that in the 80s and 70s and 80s, you know, it was a difficult feat at that point in life, you know, because there was so much to be put on a guy's shoulder then, and a lot of people got hurt in those days, you know, a lot of good name guys, Brad Doty, you know, I still get along with Brad. I mean, I was, you know, me and my brother were the first kids, you know, really around the racetrack, and we got to hang out with everybody and see everybody growing up, and it was definitely entertaining watching them have fun and goof off and, you know, be themselves when they came out to the West Coast, not being at the racetrack.
You've seen racing across America, across the board. What's toughest? Where's the toughest? Is it the Midwest? Is it the East Coast? Or is it the West Coast?
I'm going to say it's the East Coast. You know, you go back out to Pennsylvania in that area, neck of the woods. Those guys have their stuff together. You know, it definitely, if you go there and you can actually run up front and be in contention, you know, night after night, you're doing something right. You know, I've always really struggled going back to Pennsylvania. You know, coming from the short tracks of California, it's a long drive to go back there and run the C and D main half the time. You know, and we've made a couple main events. We weren't probably the greatest car there, but you know, you learn a lot. You know, I'm really good friends with Fred Raymer, and you know, he's one of those guys that can, you know, pretty much run from East Coast to West Coast. You know, but you tend to talk to those guys quite a bit, you know, and try to pick their brain on how to make yourself better, how to be more comfortable in a car and a track that, you know, you get to the end of the straightaway and your right front wheels, you know, 3 feet off the ground. It's not a comfortable feeling sometimes. You know, you definitely get the pucker and you try to find your underwear afterwards.
The best part of racing for me is not steels and wheels. It's flesh and blood. And it's the families and the teams that you work with. And last sort of few months, we've all been hanging on Shane Cricky's diagnosis, which brings it all home to me that we all race hard against each other, but at the end of the day, we're a family. And when you have someone like Shane's life in jeopardy, like it has been, it brings a lot of things back for me, and I'm sure for you too.
Yeah, I mean, I got an opportunity a few years ago to run with Shane and the entire Cricky family, and they took me under their wing. They were. It wasn't the greatest season you could probably ever say the Crickies have had in a long time, but it brought them to reality on the ups and downs in the sport again. They had great success with Brooke Tatnell, and we kind of got off on a different note. It turned into more of a friendship between me and Shane and the entire Cricky family. Pete, Julie, Taylor. I mean, I'd goof around with them. Yeah, I'd goof off with them. And she tries taking the TK name, but it's I'm older and wiser, so I got to take it. But I mean, it's good to hear that Shane's health's a little bit better. I got a text the morning that after he got out of getting all his diagnosis and everything, and he's like, I'm looking forward to having a beer with you at the Classic, and I said, you better get the Assmaster 3000 out. We had a few bottles of wine and had some goofy times, but they're great people in the sport. They hold their heads high. They're proud of what they have. And a lot of people look at them differently for it. And you shouldn't really look at people differently until you see the ins and outs of life. I've had a good friend that lost a child over the summer, and went to the World of Outlaws, and we raised money for him, and the Outlaws took it under their doing to go out and raise money for him, and the kid ran non-wing stuff, so it's definitely a family-oriented sport nowadays. You may hate the guy to death, but you're going to go out of your way to help him.
Mm-hmm.
It's usually the guys that tend to argue and piss in each other's cornflakes are the ones that help each other out first, more than anybody in this sport nowadays.
Does anything scare you?
Oh, everything does. Racing. I mean, anybody that says they're not scared of racing, they're probably lying to you. Anytime you get in one of these race cars, you never know what could happen. You look at old footage. I mean, when they didn't have roll cages on these things, that's when I come out and I say, that's when men were men and guys like me were scared. And nowadays it's turned into, we have a lot of great safety equipment, the Butler seats, deck devices. When I started racing, we didn't have that stuff, so I grew up old school. Give me a neck brace and arm restraints, and
if you even use them.
Yeah, exactly. If they even worked at that point in time, but the safety advantages have moved along so far in the sport that it's made it a safer sport. But you look at the older guys that run. You look at my dad. You look at Steve Kinzer. It's hard for them to adapt to something new. It's what's the saying? Can't teach an old dog new tricks. But I mean, every time I get in this race car, it's the anxiety takes over. You get in, you get worked up, and part of it's fear. It's that adrenaline rush that something could happen, but you're in there. You're in it to win it. You're either in it to win it, or you shouldn't be in it at all. And I think fear of driving these things is what drives people more and more nowadays, because we're so fast, so competitive, and things have gotten so close within everything in the long run. It's a few years ago, you come over here, the Americans would be 2-3 tenths quicker than everybody. Now you're within 30 car field within 2 or 3 tenths of a second. So it's racing's probably my biggest fear. Probably becoming a father someday is probably my second one, but that's not happening anytime soon. I hope not.
You're a very passionate, fun-loving, also can get fired up pretty quick kind of guy. How do you balance anger, having a good time, and all those things when you get into a race car? Because you would need to knock off the edges of some of that, or is that what you bring to the table as that kind of person? Does that help your driving?
I think it helps driving. Your anger fuels the fire, where the passion calms it down at times. but it's one big head case at times. You know, you get in the car and you can be pissed off and wound up or nervous. But the second that motor starts, it's a totally different ball game. You know, you hear the roar of the motor. You're next to guys that you may not like or you may like, and I'm probably one of the only guys that drives around and gives guys thumbs ups and wave at them or something. Just to goof off. And
it's not always a thumb that you're waving.
Yeah, no, not all the time, but I like telling people they're number one too. And,
this one's for you.
It's like me and Pete Murphy. We used to always we'd always pull up next to each other and give each other a thumbs up, pat on the side, and the gun salute, and let's go have some fun. And other guys, just picking my nose or cracking a beer with Jason Sides. I pull up next to him and pretend I'm cracking open a beer and start drinking it if we're having a bad night. You got to have fun in this sport anymore. It's become such a serious politically driven sport that you have to break that boundary sometimes. You have to have fun. You have to realize this is something. A lot of people look at you as a hero or something to that nature that you're some little kid's favorite. I mean, it's so many, like you said, so many different feelings that you feel at one time. It's hard to separate that stuff. Your adrenaline takes over. If a guy crashes you or takes you out, you definitely want to get out and go beat the living daylights out of him. But you also have to remember there's some little kid out there watching you. I mean, I'm not the perfect person. I know I've gone out and had a few words with people or pulled them out of their car and, or driven into them. It's definitely one of these sports that we do something a lot of people won't ever be able to do or can't do. And when you're doing 150 miles an hour, however many kilometers, you don't realize you're in a rocket that could hurt you or anybody else at any point in time, and you have to keep that in mind as well.